Institute Gesellschaft für Internationale Zusammenarbeit, and GIGA, the German Institute for Global Area Studies. Today we have 4 sessions that will take place in this workshop. The first session will provide you with an overview of the impacts of COVID-19 in Africa. This will be followed by a session that will look at supply chains and how they've been affected by COVID-19. Following this will be a session that will look at the impact on the informal economy. And we will close this workshop with a wrap-up session. So to begin with, I would like to welcome you to the session that is going to be held on the overview. This session will be moderated by Dr. Pamela Nakamba. Dr. Pamela Nakamba is the Executive Director of the Zambia Institute for Policy Analysis and Research in Zambia. She has a PhD from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa and has been a long-standing partner of PEGNEt. Thank you very much for having us. Welcome, everybody. I hand over to Pamela now.
Thank you, Kachana. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very delighted to moderate this panel of 4 eminent speakers. And I would like to introduce the speakers for these panels this afternoon. The first speaker is Dr. Stefani Alford. We have Dr. Stefani Alford. Dr. Stefani Alford heads the Directorate for Marshall Plan with Africa at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ. He holds a doctorate from Gießen University. Our next speaker is Dr. Stephen Karingi. Dr. Karingi is a director of the Regional Integration and Trade Division of the Economic Commission for Africa. He previously worked for the Kiel Institute for Public Policy Research and Analysis, KIPRA. We are also going to be joined by Professor Kunal Sen. Professor Sen is the director of the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics and Research, UNU-WIDER, and is a professor of development economics at the University of Manchester. Our first speaker on our panel is Mr. Pietro Toigo. Mr. Toigo is a country manager for the African Development Bank in Mozambique. He has extensive experience in development cooperation gained from the different roles at the African Development Bank, the UK's Department for International Development, and the UK Treasury and the EU Commission. So those are our speakers on our panel this afternoon. And my first question is to Mr. Toigo. Mr. Toigo, it has been more than half a year since the first COVID cases were reported in Africa. Since then, Southern Africa, including Mozambique, the country you represent, has emerged as a region with the highest COVID-19 incidence. The recent Southern African Economic Outlook on coping with COVID-19 projects reductions of economic growth of about 7 to 8%. Could you kindly tell us, Mr. Toigo, how the pandemic has affected economic activities in Southern Africa and how the African Development Bank responded to these effects?
Thank you very much, Dr. Nakamba, and thank you to PEGNEt for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm now actually representing our Director General for Southern Africa, Dr. Ngure. I'm very pleased to. She's on leave at the moment, so I'm very pleased to stand in for her, and I'll bring a general Southern African approach to this. I mean, the channels that impacted on the economy from the pandemic are they're obviously interrelated and they have knock-on effect on the economy. One of them is the impact on commodity prices prices for those countries in the region that are natural resource dependent, and that had a knock-on effect on the fiscal balances and on the balance of payments. We had an important impact on remittances, especially intra-SADC, and that is partly derived from some of the impact that the social restriction, the social distancing measures were enforced, and as well the impact on the mining industry. There is a long tradition within SADC of migrant work to work in the mining sector in South Africa, Botswana, and elsewhere. And a lot of this migration is intra-SADC, affecting remittances flows. Obviously, some countries have been that are dependent on tourism have been severely impacted. In some cases, even those countries that are not particularly dependent on tourism, they've seen very significant regional, local impact in those areas that are particularly depending on the sector. And obviously, you had all the impact on the informal sector, on those who are informal traders and are affected by the ability to move around, the ability to the shutdown of markets in a number of countries, and all the other social distancing measure. And this channel is particularly concerning because obviously it affects among the most vulnerable in the labor force and in the economic activities. All of this, of course, has a knock-on impact on the fiscal balances. The southern region already entered the crisis fairly exposed from a fiscal point of view. And this is obviously adding to fairly limited fiscal space to respond. In terms of the response of the African Development Bank in the Southern African region, we have approved, and this is only the first short-term phase, you mentioned 6 months, we've approved just south of $700 million specifically from our crisis response facilities, and a Pan-African facility, but in the Southern African region we've approved around $670 million, and these are going in two directions. One, in a very sectorial approach, has been working at the regional level, mostly with the WHO, to supply the type of emergency materials, medical consumables that are necessary for the short-term response. The other approach has been to provide emergency fiscal space to government to implement their short-term response plans. And the decision has been to go through, in this second channel, to go through the fiscus, to go through the national budgets, because it was the fastest way to scale up in a systemic manner the multifaceted type of response that is needed. This will respond to the country-specific response plans, but one can identify 3 broad areas where the support is going: scaling up the health system, especially in terms of testing and tracing, expanding temporarily, at least, social protection system, often to incorporate also informal workers that normally are in the labor force but have seen themselves significantly affected. And the third area is extending support and cash flow relief to the private sector through tax deferrals, through waivers on some of the fixed utility costs, or in some cases to line of credit. And specific attention has gone here to the agricultural sector and to maintaining the food supply chains and what we call green corridors, to make sure that despite the border closures and despite the necessary restrictions, you do continue to have especially supply of food to food insecure and food vulnerable areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Toigo, and thank you so much for the African Development Bank for those interventions. Now, I'm turning now to Professor Sen. Professor Sen, Mr. Toigo has just pointed out the effects of the pandemic in Southern Africa. Other African regions have also been affected by the pandemic, albeit with much lower incidence. Now, could you let us know how the research community, and in particular research at the UNU-WIDER, how it has responded to the pandemic in Africa? Are there any key research results that you'd like to highlight?
Thank you, Pamela, for inviting me for this panel. So in UNU-WIDER, we started working on the pandemic at a very early stage. And we did a large volume of working papers, blogs, background notes, and also started several projects on the pandemic. And I just want to give you some sense of the findings we are getting at this point. I should note that this is very early days for getting concrete research findings. We're still in a situation where getting data is a problem. But let me give you a sense of what kind of research findings we've got so far from our work. So for example, our work in Mozambique, we have colleagues working there who have developed a lockdown readiness index for Mozambique and other African countries. And one important finding of their work is that they find that strict lockdown policies may not only be difficult to enforce, but also might heighten the risk of conflict. The strict lockdown policy is not only difficult in terms of enforcement, as we already know, but they might actually increase the possibility of conflict. And that's something to keep that in mind when you think about lockdown policies. Secondly, the work we are doing with ISER, where we're conducting a survey of around 670 workers in Ghana, in different parts of Ghana, asking retrospective questions on how the pandemic affected employment and earnings as compared to pre-pandemic levels. So sort of comparing what's happened since the lockdown to what possibly happened before. And this is part of a project transforming informal work and livelihoods, very much to what was mentioned earlier on, looking at informality and particularly the effects of COVID on informal workers. So what we find from this work so far, again, very early days in terms of our research findings. We just conducted the survey in August. So we're getting very preliminary results at this point. But we're finding here that most people express support for the government response measures to contain the spread of the virus. There was support for the government to bring out lockdown policies. At the same time, they were concerned about the loss of income and employment in relation to these measures. So while they supported the measures, they were also worried about what these measures might imply for their livelihoods. That is an important finding. Also, we found that the number of respondents who reported running out of money to buy food, as well as essential non-food items, doubled between February and April 2020. So pretty much around March, April, we started seeing lockdown policies. But they showed clear signs of recovery in August. And that's encouraging. In terms of employment, out of those who were working in February 2020, around 40% were still actively working in April. 45% had temporarily stopped working, mainly due to the lockdown, and another 10% had permanently stopped working. But what was interesting was we see a strong recovery in employment in August. By August, when we did the survey, 84% of those who had been working initially were working again. It's quite a strong recovery. But we did not see a similar recovery on working hours and earnings, where there was still a negative effect. And that's important to keep in mind. So the effect on employment seems to be more muted once lockdown is eased. The effect on incomes and working hours seems to be more permanent, at least till August. And there again, it was interesting that we found that wage workers who are working in more formalized forms of employment, for example, those who have written contracts, working in the public sector, union coverage, and social security contributions, were more likely to continue working during April, while among self-employed, we found that there was little difference between informal and formal self-employed, which seems to suggest, and again, from very early results here, the pandemic may have affected the self-employed more than the wage employed. And that's interesting, because we need to differentiate between different kinds of informal workers. We also had a smaller survey in South Africa, which largely corroborated these findings. I want to just say very quickly one important point, that the challenge that we are facing, and this is a challenge that not only UNI-WIDER is facing, but many other organizations, in working on the pandemic's effects, is the lack of robust data. That allows us to infer the pandemic's effects on employment and earnings with any degree of confidence. Why is that? Well, three reasons. First is that we don't really have baseline data. We don't really have a reliable pre-pandemic data on employment earnings. So just before the pandemic hit, let's say January, February or so, or even late last year. So we don't really have that kind of data. Secondly, we do not have sampling frames in many countries. If you do not have sampling frames that generate representative samples of workers, then the sample that you might have collected data on might not be true for the whole population. And therefore, one has to be careful not to infer from samples that you collect what is happening to the whole population if you don't have a sampling frame. And finally, we know that it's almost impossible to do face-to-face surveys. And so what we are doing, as we did in Ghana, one is doing phone surveys. And phone surveys have high refusal rates. We already saw that in our work in Ghana. Much less likely that people will be willing to respond to a phone survey as compared to a face-to-face survey. So what does it mean for us researchers? It means that our core challenge for researchers, policymakers, and donors will be to fill this data gap. That's essential, right? And asking the right question will also be key to unlocking policy solutions. So filling the data gap, asking the right questions is really, really important. And understanding the transmission mechanism of the COVID-19 crisis in labor markets, how does exactly COVID-19 play out in labor markets? Identifying who's being affected and who's not, and categorizing the employment effects is essentially to ensure that we have the right policy response to help out those who are really in need. So there's a real major data challenge we need to respond to as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'll move to Dr. Karingi. Dr. Karingi, many of us within the development community waited excitedly as countries ratified the African Continental Free Trade Area last year. Unfortunately, COVID-19 hit before the Continental Free Trade could be launched. Can you tell us how the pandemic has affected the implementation of the AFCFTA, and what role do you think the AFCFTA could have played in mitigating some of the effects of the pandemic which have been discussed so far?
Thank you, Pamela. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope I'm loud and clear. And let me recognize my two colleagues that have gone before me, and also thank the organizers for this event. Now, first of all, let me start by saying that as we speak now, the African Ministers of Trade are actually meeting to see how to make sure that come 1st of January 2021, the continent will start trading under the AFCFTA. But having said that, because of the pandemic, it's acceptable that the African member states decided to focus on protecting lives and also protecting economies. But as we have as we know, we could not continue with these lockdowns, because if that were to happen, then the economies are going to suffer significantly, to the point that even when you start now implementing the CFTA, you would actually have difficulties, because you'll be coming from a very, very devastated private sector, and intra-African trade would actually be a big issue. So what is it then that one can say at this point? If we are to recover and to build resilience in the medium term and also in the long term, it is very important that the AFCFTA momentum and ambition is sustained. And that is why I'm excited that our ministers, because I was in that meeting before I came here, they are actually spending time and looking at how can they ensure that the outstanding work that they could not do because of the pandemic is finalized, so that the state parties can actually start trading come 1st of January next year. Now, the fiscal pressures that Toijo has spoken about and the financial stress, this should not be seen as a reason not to forge ahead with the AFCFTA. Because what the COVID-19 has amplified for us are at least two things that I would want to highlight. The first thing that we have seen out of this pandemic is that intra-African trade actually offers a pathway for job creation, foreign exchange earning, industrial development, and also the economic growth of the African economy. So it's important that the AFCFTA is implemented because it is going to address some of the challenges that have arisen out of the COVID-19. The second thing that COVID-19 has done is actually to shed light on the developed nature of the supply and value chains within the continent. The AFCFTA is actually meant to build these supply chains. And things have not been quite good for Africa because the epicenter of the pandemic moved from China, where Africa's trade is about 11% in terms of its Africa's exports and 16% in terms of its imports. And then it moved to Europe, which accounts for the greatest share of Africa's exports and Africa's imports. So what this tells us is that unless we were to deepen intra-African trade, then the continent would always be exposed the way it found itself exposed as a result of the pandemic. So moving forward, it's important that the continent moves ahead and implements the AFCFTA. It's important that we also see the AFCFTA as a way to inoculate the continent against some of the challenges that the pandemic brought up. And it's also important for us to realize that the continent has not been at the same position like the developed countries. So the AFCFTA offers an opportunity to provide a stimulus to the African economy. And I would like to conclude by saying that it is important as the AFCFTA is implemented that it is done in an inclusive and in a way that everybody benefits. And I think the impact on the small traders, especially the informal cross-border traders that we are going to talk about in other sessions, it's important that they are taken care of in the implementation of the AFCFTA because the pandemic has actually shown that MSMEs, informal cross-border traders, can actually suffer significantly from a shock like the one we are having at the moment. So that's what I would want to say at this point. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Karingi, and I'm glad to see the progress being made towards implementation of the FTA. Now I'll turn back to you, Mr. Toigo. Shortly after the spread of the pandemic, a number of international organizations, including the ADB, released projections on how the economies will be affected by COVID-19. Now we know that some of these projections overestimated the number of COVID-19 related fatalities in Africa. Now, will the long-term and medium-term impacts of the COVID-19 projected in the African economic outlook differ now that COVID-19 related mortality is not as high as was expected? And if this is the case, how will the ADB adjust some of the recommendations presented to policymakers in the African economic outlook?
Thank you very much. And let me say, we're actually very pleased to have got the mortality projections wrong and see that we had less people dying in the continent. But I think the bottom line has always been that the economic damage of the pandemic would exceed the health damage. And I think we are broadly in line with this. I don't see a great deviation from what our expectation of the economic impact was. If anything, the fact that governments have been fairly disciplined and fairly fast in implementing social distancing measures mean that we had less people dying. Also, which is also reflective of a different demographic structure in the African continent than elsewhere. But in terms of the predictions, and sorry, I just wanted to do a little parenthesis to say that the Professor Sen mentioned one of the studies that UN-WIDER carried out in Mozambique, and it's a study that I know very well, and had a fair amount of impact actually in terms of the policy-making discussions, also in terms of some of the policy measures, especially in access to water for households, because you really looked at the vulnerability at household level for a lockdown. But it's also to point out that we do need this type of research to address and fine-tune policy. In terms of the policy recommendations, I think we're broadly, we wouldn't, be particularly concerned of being off because of the mortality rates. I think especially what the Africa Economic Outlook says in terms of the structural reform and the structural changes to the African economies. And here is important that policymakers grab the opportunities offered by the crisis and by the pandemic. And one set of opportunities lies generally with digitalization. We have seen governments rushing to embrace, for example, digital payments in social security systems during the pandemic for obvious reasons. You don't want people to queue up in government offices to withdraw their social payments, but that's a great opportunity to ensure that those changes remain in the structural use of digital means of payment that can also support more digital access and access to finance to poor households. The other area is what Professor Karingi was mentioning. There is an opportunity in the disruption of traditional industrial supply chains and trading patterns. There is an opportunity to onshore some of the production and industrial opportunities in the African continent. We've seen it to some extent and to a very small scale, for example, with production of non-medical protection equipment, which in other situations is the type of thing that would be bulk imported from abroad. For this to work, it's extremely important that as we look at reopening and as we're looking at more modulated approaches to lockdown that UN-WIDER has been arguing, for example, we really push hard in enabling inter-African trading patterns. And clearly the free trade area agreement is one of the big priorities for the continent for the years to come, one that the African Development Bank is supporting very aggressively. And there is an interim role for the regional economic community in helping and facilitating the reopening of trading patterns in a way that facilitates the onshoring of some of the industrial bases, taking advantage of the disruption. I make an example, and it's an area that we are looking at as African Development Bank, is the pharmaceutical industry in Africa. We have seen disruptions in supply just because of the surge in some of the and the demand on some of the produce and pharmaceutical industry. This is not a particularly complex industry, and it is one where we can definitely look at the industrial opportunities and the financing opportunities. We are a financial organization, but will require the ability of countries to overcome the regulatory barriers that allows inputs to circulate across African borders. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Toigo. Professor Sen, to you now. The pandemic has been marked by large amounts of uncertainty, which made it so difficult for policymakers to adopt research-based measures and policies aimed at curbing the effects of the pandemic. Now, to what extent do you think that the research generated on COVID-19 will be or have been used by African policymakers? And can you already give concrete examples of such uptake by policymakers? If not, what have constrained such uptake?
Thank you for that question. I think that already we can see evidence that the research generated on COVID-19 is being used by policymakers. And let me give some concrete examples from UNI-WIDER's own work. So for example, in South Africa, we have a country program. And in that country program, one of the first things we try to do is to model the effect of the lockdown on GDP, employment, and so on. So we had this first pass estimates the cost of the lockdown implemented by the South African government, and we also presented a series of recovery scenarios. We said, okay, fine, if this is the implication of lockdown, how do you get out of it? And what we found in that research was that the research showed that the economic cost and the impact of the first 21 days of the lockdown would lead to a contraction of South African GDP by about 5 to 16% in 2020. That was the very first estimate. That was before we had the more recent quarterly estimates GDP in South Africa. And this particular set of findings gained substantial traction in the South African media landscape and was very useful in the debate in South African policymakers, especially the National Treasury. So that's again where we went early with some research findings, tried to use our model-based estimates of what might happen with lockdown on employment and output and so on, and where it seemed that this particular approach we did, which was still based on models and not actual data, really helped to shape the debate on the implications of the lockdown in South Africa. One example. Another example, again, for South Africa, the work we're doing there, is we did work on the fiscal multipliers. And what we found in the set of papers we did was that in countries with high public debt, as in South Africa, unproductive expenditures not linked to social transfers can have negative effects on growth. Negative effects. In other words, normally you expect fiscal multipliers to have positive effects on growth. But in this case, with high public debt, government expenditures which are not productive can actually have negative effects on growth. And this particular set of findings again led to a lot of discussion in South African media, especially around fiscal consolidation, because South Africa has a problem with low economic growth, not just because of the pandemic, but even before, and also because obviously of declining tax revenues. And this research was actually highlighted by the South African finance minister in an opinion piece that was written for a South African media outlet, and led to a lot of debate. Of course, one can always sort of say, are these estimates we produce on fiscal multiplication right or not? No, I don't think so, because this is difficult to estimate. But I think the argument we're trying to contribute to is what should be the nature of fiscal consolidation in South Africa, given the current economic environment. So that's the second example of our research having essentially some amount of policy impact. A third example is from the work we're doing in Mozambique, where the Mozambican government have a social protection initiative, which was essentially developed from a proposal that was that UNI-WIDER researchers in Mozambique contributed to. And that's now ongoing, and we're providing technical support to the design of the social protection scheme. So I think these examples, suggest that there is real demand right now, among policymakers for good research. So that the point here is two. One is that it has to be good research. There's no doubt about it. Rigorous research, right? And secondly, the research has to essentially try to meet current policy demands, whether it's through social protection programs, whether it's to do with fiscal policy changes, whether it's to do with what does the lockdown, implication of lockdowns imply for employment, output, and so on. So I think it really shows that there is a real need for that. And I do think that what we should try and respond to as researchers, like UNI-WIDER is trying to do, is respond to this policy demand, because there's really a very important need for good research at this point. Thank you.
Also from the BMZ, and I'm turning to you now. Welcome to the panel. Dr. Alford, the BMZ's Marshall Plan with Africa outlines how Germany plans to cooperate with Africa on a partnership-based level to support the attainment of the African Union's Agenda 2063, Can you inform us how the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic has affected the implementation of the Marshall Plan? Has the implementation of the Compact with Africa also been affected in a similar manner? Dr. Alford.
Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Nakamba. I'm very sorry we had some technical problems, so I only joined you in the middle of the speech of Pietro Torrigo. To come to your question, well, what did it mean for us? We already in March decided in the ministry to reprogram current year funds in the tune of €1 million to assist our partners based on requests placed to us. And let's say it was focusing, of course, on reinforcement of public health sector, food security, securing jobs, providing liquidity to companies and states, securing loans for SMEs, as well as contributions to multilateral organizations to assist them to do something they had been requested to do. Another €3 billion were made available later in the year at around May, June by the German Parliament, and we are, of course, ending up with around 1.5 for this year and another 1.5 for the next year to be spent on COVID-related activities. On the African continent, the regional focus, we are focusing on the Sahel region, on our reform partner countries, which is, let's say, part of the compact countries, and of course, the Horn of Africa, South Africa, Rwanda, Kenya, and Nigeria, as well as on the cooperation with the African Union, but also with regional economic communities. Through more than 300 projects and measures, we are currently reorienting €500 million from existing programs towards corona response. And we have also allocated additional new funds towards our corona response. To come more particularly to your question, this does not mean that we need to stop implementing the Marshall Plan with Africa. Actually, the opposite is true. The well-established structures, especially in the context of the reform partnerships, helped us to react quickly and in an efficient manner. For example, Senegal and Ethiopia requested for emergency assistance, so we made available funds directly allocated to the budget, but also in the smaller level, through our cooperation with the Central African Forest Commission, we can now implement, or we were able to implement, corona awareness campaigns in 7 natural protection areas. This includes reaching out to indigenous people with the information on the virus, hygiene measures, and also testing kits and something like that. So it ranges really from an emergency support on the line down to, let's say, very practical measures where we are reprogramming, let's say, a couple of €1,000 to assist communities to do something better. Also, probably to add on, we very much cooperate with in development partnerships with private sector, especially in South Africa. Professor Sen, we interacted very much with BMW, Siemens, and VW, and together with the South African authorities, we jointly provided more than 4,000 additional hospital beds through a joint operation. And in all the 6 of our reform partner countries, we initiated either so-called emergency responses, I was already remarking on, but through our existing cooperation, we have also the possibility, let's say, to be flexible in, let's say, taking into account partners' actions in declaring the glass half full instead of half empty. So that also enabled us to make funds available more fast than under normal circumstances. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Alford. You have just explained how in times of crisis, quick financial flows are essential, even if the Marshall Plan is based on the premise of partnership. Now, these quick transfers of aid are more in line with the traditional donor-recipient relationship rather than the partnership advocated for in the Marshall Plan. Now, how will the Marshall Plan ensure that a partnership-based relationship is maintained with African countries in a post-COVID world?
Of course, you're absolutely right that, let's say, the flexibility we had shown was not always strictly following the rules. I explained that of course, while observing the implementation of a joint reform or reform program initiated by the reform partner country and presented to the compact, where we are basing our support in the context of the reform partnership, is clearly linked to a results-based framework. So it is, of course, something we had to decide very carefully whether the reform program is really on track and that the necessary decisions have been enacted in a certain way to enable us, although it has not been fully implemented, to declare that, let's say, the level of implementation was sufficient to declare the glass half full. So we really try to balance up between the actual need we also observed in a certain country and, let's say, the program we were in. And I think we found a good compromise on that. So the post-COVID world means, of course, also, let's say, certain arrangements are not necessarily cast in stone to adjust, let's say, a certain reform program and also the implementation of such a program to the actual situation on the ground. Because one has to look at the implementation then with the eyes of 2020 or 2021 and not with the eyes of 2018, where the situation was completely different. So, let's say, a results-based financing, which is, let's say, one of the key features of a reform partnership, we have not compromised on that. So it is going back to the traditional relationships you were mentioning, but you really have to balance up in let's say, assessing the situation that, let's say, if the environment has changed, you cannot ignore that. And in order to put things significantly on track, it is, of course, very important. Looking, let's say, on the concept of reform partnership in Morocco, Tunisia, and Senegal, which are, let's say, private sector and especially SME, with the SME focus, what we are intending to normally do is, of course, also serving the needs of the post-COVID world. The same is true, let's say, with private sector involvement in the field of renewable energy in Ghana and Ivory Coast. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Alford. Dr. Karingi, Dr. Alford just talked about the Marshall Plan and what they've been able to do in the light of the pandemic. Dr. Karingi, the Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Africa, Dr. Vera Songwe, have been quoted as saying that Africa does not need a Marshall Plan. How do you think that the Africa Free Continental Trade Area supersedes other economic development plans for Africa, such as the Marshall Plan with Africa?
No, thank you. Thank you very much. And so let me first clarify what the Executive Secretary of ECA, Dr. Songwe, said. She said that Africa does not need a Marshall Plan to ride out the ongoing coronavirus crisis. It has a more tool in the AFTA to use in accelerating regional and economic integration and prepare for uncertain times. So as you can see in her statement, the reference was not to the DMZ's Marshall Plan with Africa, which calls for a new kind of collaboration between Germany and Africa, as Oswald has explained. Essentially, she was referring to the Marshall Plan that was passed in 1948, which all of us are familiar with. And so it is a conversation that goes to Africa beyond aid agenda. It's a conversation that essentially is looking towards an Africa that can optimize the use of its resources, its creativity, its innovation in financing the continent's development agenda. And it's a conversation that is looking towards mutual benefit and one that requires forging stronger trade and investment partnerships that serve Africa's interests. And I think listening to Oswald and what we know about Marshall Plan with Africa, it's about that. It's where Africa's interests are served in the context of having a partnership in the area of trade and investment in this issue. So coming closely to now the question, the second part that you asked about the ASEFTA. Of course, as I said in my first intervention, Africa does not have the kind of resources that developed countries have that has allowed them to give the kind of stimulus up to $13 trillion to support their businesses, both big and small, or even the workers that have actually been asked to stay at home because of the lockdowns. What the Africa has is the AFCFTA, which is quite broad and deep in scope, something that Africa has not done in the past, and it is creating a platform that will enable both big business, small business, including the young people, the women, to use that platform to create jobs and also to attract investment. So if you look at the private investments in private investors from Germany, even in the context of the trade and investment partnership between Africa and Germany and Europe or other developed countries for that matter, the AFCFTA is offering that platform that will attract those investments. It will no longer be a focus on aid, but it will become now a focus of trade and investment partnerships. So essentially that is what the AFCFTA offers itself as a blueprint for a new Africa that is focused on investment, development, jobs, and trade. And her statement had absolutely nothing to do with the Marshall Plan with Africa, but essentially saying we do not need the Marshall Plan that was there in 1948. We have a tool that can actually be used to foster the kind of trade and investment partnerships that are foreseen in the Marshall Plan with Africa by the Germans. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, participants, and thank you to the speakers. We have come to the end of this session, which has provided a general overview for the impact of COVID-19 in Africa. So the next sessions will deal more into the details. The next session, which is coming up, will be moderated by Dr. Corina Braun-Munzinga, Dr. Vancigun is an advisor at the GIZ Competence Center for Economic Policy and Private Sector Development. She has a PhD from the University of Manchester and is an expert on supply chain. Thank you. Off to the next session.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Yes, so thank you and welcome to this next session on the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains in Africa. So some of the questions that we will hopefully be looking at and we'll be able to probably not answer completely, but get some more details on in the session will be what are the impacts of COVID-19 on trade, supply chains, foreign investment in Africa, and how deep are these shocks actually, and can we expect a quick recovery? And also, obviously, what are the feasible policy options to respond to the crisis and how can development cooperation adjust? So we have three speakers here on the panel today. Our first speaker is Máximo Torero, who is the chief economist at the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations in Rome. Mr. Torero has worked at the World Bank in Washington, D.C., prior to joining the FAO, as well as at the International Food Policy Research Institute, and he holds a PhD in economics from the University of California. Our second panelist is Holger Gerk from the IFW in Kiel. He is a professor of international economics at the University of Kiel and head of the research area Global Division of Labor at IFW. He also is director of the Kiel Center for Globalization. Previously, he has worked at the University of Nottingham, the University of Ulster at Jordanstown, and the University College Cork, and he holds a PhD in economics from Trinity College Dublin. And our third speaker on this panel is Amy Jadisimi, who is managing director of LADUL, which is a free zone and logistics hub for multinational industrial and offshore companies in Lagos, Nigeria. Dr. Jadisimi received a degree in as a medical doctor from Oxford University Medical School, has then gone on to join Goldman Sachs Investment Banking in London, before completing an MBA at Stanford Business School. After this, she moved back to Nigeria and set up a financial consultancy firm before she joined LADUL as a managing director. So welcome to all of the speakers. Very much looking forward to the discussion. So maybe just for everybody to clarify the structure of the session, we are going to start with a very brief statement by each of the panelists, about 5 to 6 minutes, to just very quickly, like an elevator pitch, highlight what are the key aspects from your point of view with regard to the impact of COVID-19 on trade, supply chains, and foreign investment in Africa, what are potential opportunities, and what are policy recommendations. I will give the speakers a little warning after 5 minutes to try to keep it short, to be able to have some time for discussion afterwards. And for the discussion, I would like to invite all participants to write your questions in the chat so we can include them and try to include as many questions from the audience as possible in the conversation with the panelists. So then I would like to ask Máximo Torero, could you please start with a brief statement on your views on the impact of COVID-19 on supply chains in Africa?
Thank you very much. It is important to understand the effects of COVID-19 to start thinking on how sub-Saharan Africa and how it started and how it was unstable before even the pandemic. So in 2019 alone, 235 million experienced chronic hunger and 66 million people have acute food insecurity already in Africa. Therefore, protection of food supply chains and livelihoods has to be prioritized, and that was a central core. Although we have not seen today yet, with some exceptions in the south part of Africa, in the west, a significant increase in the COVID-19 cases, and it was mentioned before, the death rates have not been as what it was projected initially. But the overall economic effects of the crisis are unlike any recent history. So in sub-Saharan Africa, the projection is of a contraction of the GDP of 2.8% per year, while in the MENA region it will plunge to 4.2% decrease in GDP growth, and in North Africa, figures, for example, for Tunisia is 21.6% decline, Morocco 17% decline, and Egypt 8% decline. This put a huge pressure over the demand side. So it's not only the difference of this shock is that demand and a supply shock. Initially, was affecting more the supply because of the logistical issues, especially for the high-value commodities, less for the staple, which are more capital-intensive. But now what we are facing is more the demand shock, which is as a result of this significant recession. Now, initially, there was a concern about potential prices hikes in Africa, especially because of their net food importing countries. And this was as a result of the problem of some export bans that were put initially at the beginning of the COVID-19 process. Initially, we had around 20 countries putting export restrictions, which meant 5% of the global traded food in the world. Today, we have close to zero. It's less than 0.5, the affected trade. So that problem was resolved. The logistical issues were resolved. But despite that, if you look at the food crisis countries within Africa, and you look at the countries which have productive crisis, those countries are facing some problems of prices, but which are not linked directly to COVID-19, but are because of the exacerbation of the situation, given that it's more difficult to move commodities among those countries. So current data indicates that only 10 countries currently have export restrictions in place compared to 33 in 2008 and 2009, and those in countries already, as I mentioned before, reduced their export restrictions. Now, what are the results of the global trade and flows in Africa? So at a global level, we have seen that the agricultural sector has been resilient. However, in Africa, rapid assessments that we have undertaken show that trade in the non-food products, this means flowers, cut flowers, tobacco, cotton, and perishables like fruits and vegetables, fish, meat, dairy, and eggs, have been suffering from the disruptions, and they will be suffering substantially because of the recession. Cotton is already suffering, for example, in Mali, and in many other West African countries. Tea and coffee, especially Arabica coffee, is affecting, which Ethiopia, for example, is a key exporter of Arabica coffee. And floriculture has basically had a serious problem because of the stopping of the flights. Most of the flower is moved through airplanes, and there was a stop, and that affects, of course, this industry substantially. Imports have been affected by logistical disruptions and containment measures, particularly affecting horticultural, live animals, and livestock. And it's important to understand also that a significant amount of the trade in Africa is informal. And with the process of lockdowns, that also complicated the situation of the informal moving. So border delays, spoilages of fresh fruits in Kenya, Tanzania, trade in livestock has been affected in Burkina Faso, Eritrea. North African countries, there is also the risk of international supply chain disruptions, that they all depend on imports of cereals. And what is happening in Northern Africa, which is important to alert, one of the last things that still is pending in terms of the logistical part for trade is that the change of vessel crews. So vessel mobility was disrupted at the beginning, that was resolved, but now vessel crews is the problem. Crews needs to change because they cannot be more than 6 to 9 months in the sea. And Northern African countries still are not allowing for switching vessels, a cruise, and that's a problem, no? Because if they cannot switch the vessel crew, then of course they could start facing some disruptions in the mobility of food. Now, on the demand side, all the commodity prices will be affected, and they are starting to be affected. Oil prices, of course, which affects many countries in Africa, especially Nigeria, Chad, Algeria, Angola, Mozambique, will be affected because of this. And also, we have one more problem in Africa, which is in East Africa, especially the locust outbreak. No? And the locust outbreak was projected to force 25 million people into hunger across Ethiopia, Kenya, Somalia, Uganda, and Sudan. And the swarm covering 1 square kilometer contains 80 million insects and consumes more than in 24 hours the food that 35 people can eat. And that's something that FAO is doing a lot of efforts with partners to try to control, but there are some consequences that we will need to cope with. So the situation is tense. Although the value chains are showing to be resilient, people still have food availability. There is not a problem of food scarcity. We have food availability. There is a problem of food access. And that's where we need to focus, especially because in these countries in the region, most of them are already indebted. And although there has been they don't have to pay the services of the debt in this year. That is not the case for the next year. And they will be affected by the recession. This could also affect the level of losses. Why? Because countries that were exporting to other parts of Africa, of the world, especially Europe and North America, they will face a shrink in the demand of these countries of this produce, and this will be left in the field, which means that this will be significant increase in losses in high-value commodities, and that's something to look at it. But despite this, the numbers of COVID-19 are not as serious as we have projected before, which is good news. We just need to find ways in which we can reactivate the economy, and one solution to that is interregional trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maximo. Then I would like to pass to Holger Gerk for your brief statement.
Yes, and first of all, thank you very much for having me in this conference. I'm really enjoying the discussion so far. I just want to say a few words on Africa's role in terms of, or the implications of COVID in Africa on its role in global supply chains. Perhaps to start off with, or I probably want to give a more, if you like, more aggregate overview than we just heard. And I want to look particularly at Africa's position in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment inflows. Perhaps to give a framework, if we look at recent data, Africa as a continent attracted about as much foreign investment as Germany had in 2019. So Africa accounts for about 2.4% of total inward investment in the world, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about. So Africa's position in global value chains as measured by FDI stocks, and that's similar in terms of international trade as well, is very, very small. And that's something to keep in mind. And that's where the effects of the COVID crisis then bite as well. So if one looks at foreign direct investment flows, of course, as one of the previous speakers said as well, we're still at a very early stage, and it's difficult to get data and to see where exactly we're going. But I think we already have some data to see what happens to trade and foreign direct investment. Let me talk particularly about foreign direct investment. Some recent data suggests that from UNCTAD, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, suggests that foreign direct investment in terms of greenfield investment, for example, if one compares March 2020 to March 2019, has dropped by 50%, roughly 50%, and that's the same for cross-border investments. Now that's across the whole world, of course. And as I said, Africa has relatively little foreign direct investment to start with. And if we're considering a further drop in this, we're really talking about very low levels. And UNCTAD also predicts that in the course of 2020, for Africa as a continent overall, FDI, foreign direct investment inflows will probably drop between 25 and 40%, depending on the scenario one takes. So Africa's position in global value chains has been very small traditionally, and it's likely to become even less important. But then global value chains have changed overall. And I think there are two issues here. One is the current fall in demand. So global value chains shrink because there's a fall in demand due to lockdown measures in a lot of countries around the world. That's a very immediate effect. And here one could say, well, Africa is lucky because they're not involved that heavily in current global value chains. So there's not that much to lose for them. I think where Africa will be affected much more is more in the medium to long term, where companies now around the world, and perhaps we'll hear more about this, where companies around the world are thinking about reorganizing their global value chains. And that's where you may see implications, possible implications for Africa out of this reorganization could potentially go two ways. On the one hand, Africa might lose. If there's a shortening of global value chains, of course, are mainly based in North America and in Europe. That's where the final consumers are, with supply chain suppliers in Asia at the moment. So if the supply chains shorten, so a lot of production is reshored to, say, Europe or to the United States or North America in general, that of course then also diminishes Africa's potential for involvement in global value chains. Why is involvement in global value chains potentially good? Well, because a lot of studies show that through global value chains, through foreign direct investment, through trade, countries are able to grow. Firms, companies are able to increase their productivity, their competitive position, and countries are able to grow. So a shortening of global value chains negatively affecting Africa would also negatively affect the potential to grow. On the other side, if we're talking about reshoring of production, there's potentially a positive effect for Africa. Because as I said, a lot of final consumers, a lot of the multinationals are based in Europe. And if European firms are reshoring from Asia back to near Europe, then of course the African continent is near Europe. So this reshoring, regionalization of European production in particular may actually put Africa on the map as a potential supply and also market base because it's geographically close, certainly much closer than Asia in the supply chains. So how this is going to pan out depends a lot on how attractive countries are. How attractive countries in Africa are as locations for global value chains that have their main source in Europe. And this is where I think one can move over to like a to-do list for policy. I think just two sentences. One is, if you want to be attractive to location of multinationals, just being a low-cost production hub is not enough, no longer enough. Certainly not enough if you're thinking about attracting what the EU leaders of the UN calls quality FDI. That's where the good jobs are. Just being low-cost is not enough. What matters here are good institutions. Countries need to have support services in terms of investment promotion agencies. Countries need to have support services in terms of supplier networks being there, in terms of information about supplier networks being made available. They need to have a good skills base. And of course, there mustn't be any trade frictions. And what was already mentioned also by one of the previous speakers, this is where the African Continental Free Trade Area also comes into play. Reducing trade frictions within Africa would be important for it to become an attractive base for global value chains based in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Then I would like to ask Amy to continue with her statement, please.
Hi, thanks for having me. As sometimes happens on these panels, I see things somewhat differently from my perspective as someone who works for a company that builds infrastructure. The company I work for has developed an industrial-free zone out of a swamp over the last 20 years or so. So we're long-term indigenous investors. I used to be a banker in a former life as well, so I think those two things inform my view. And really, FDI, even into a country like Nigeria, the biggest economy in Africa, in real terms is negligible in terms of the impact it has on our economy and so forth on the best of times. So one of the, and I'll look at the positive sides because there are obviously a lot of stress caused by COVID-19, but one of the biggest positives to come out of this for Nigeria is that it has forced us to correct some serious market failures that have kept the market small, that have made it difficult for indigenous private sector to grow their companies. And, that all has to center around real local content, manufacturing things locally, local industrialization. It also has to center around government policies such as deregulation in the oil and gas sector, which will help the development of local refineries. It has to do with deregulation of the electricity sector, which will help with power. And most of the investments into these sectors, and I mean like 90%, actually comes from indigents in the public and private sector.
And a lot of these investments haven't done well in the past and have been very closely tied to public sector. But what we're seeing happen now in Nigeria is that the private sector is being given a much bigger role because the government is having to step back because of the stress caused not just by COVID, but what has been happening, for the last 20 years. At the same time, the government policies are geared towards that. The president has put in place a number of executive orders. There's been spotty implementation and not enough accountability, but the executive orders are there, the laws are there, and now with this deregulation, there are opportunities for private sector. So where I see potentially COVID-19 having the biggest impact is increasing the level of local production, which will be locally funded, and maybe in another year or 2 or 3, those locally funded businesses will now attract serious FDI. And that's the pattern we've seen in pretty much every country that's developed from low income to middle income. And maybe 1 or 2 to high income, but most get stuck in middle income. But the point I'm making is that from an African perspective, we need to look beyond the status quo that has been established over the last 40 years, which has led to a situation where we really haven't benefited from global trade. And to the extent that we have not been able to benefit from global trade because of self-inflicted market failures, what's happening during COVID is that due to change in government policies, change in the mindset, because you have a lot of middle class and upper class people who are stuck in Nigeria, for example, for much longer this year than they have, probably than they spent for the past 30 years of their lives. They're now here, and that's, Nigeria from southern to northern Nigeria, and that changes the mindset, changes the outlook. And then necessity, because there are some things we've had to make ourselves because we haven't been able to import them. And then finally, and most importantly, a realization of the opportunity. So we always knew the opportunity was there, but we weren't able to fully realize it, in part due to regulation, in part due to availability of finance, and in part due to the will of enough people in the local private sector willing to make those investments. So as far as this goes, impacts the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, the biggest fear we have as Africans is that this will be a conduit for cheap products from abroad to flood the African continent, and we won't see the same positive impacts as the EU saw from having their common market. And then this is a serious threat. But the antidote to that threat is to industrialize across the continent. And I think this crisis has pushed us more in that direction. And the lack of FDI, I don't think will have a negligible, significant impact on this development, because it wasn't driving industrialization in Africa in a significant way anyway. What I worry more about is the drop in remittances, and I think there's been over 20% drop in remittances this year because of COVID. Obviously, that does have an impact. So we need governments to do more to support SMEs and to make sure that we have different financing structures in place so that every sector of society can get access to local finance to develop these businesses.
Okay, thank you, Amy. Thank you very much. So just a reminder to all participants, please keep the questions coming in the chat so we can post them to the panelists and include your perspectives and views and questions as well. So I would first of all like to ask Maximo, would you agree with Amy's statement that Africa so far has not very much benefited from global trade, and that yes, and that you would would you agree with the statement that Africa has not much benefited from global trade? And you were talking about the negative impact also on the economy from some of the trade in non-food products, for instance, that has been reduced due to the crisis. Could you enlighten us a little bit on how you see the impact on regional value chains in agricultural products, be it food or non-food, and on global value chains in agricultural products?
So what Amy is saying is correct. If we simulate what is the potential of Africa in terms of global trade and what they are doing today, is they are under trading what they should be. So they have a significant space where they can grow. Now, what are the causes behind this? There are many reasons. Is financing one, trade barriers two, and the third one is food safety issues. So those are an infrastructure, of course. Those are the four bigger problems I think that they have, and the reason why they are under exporting to what they should be their potential. Now, what is even worse, and where there is a lot of opportunity, I think, especially what you were saying in terms of the relaxation of the regulations because the governments are not cannot do what they used to do before, is intra-regional trade. So Africa has a huge potential for intra-regional trade. And there is an African Free Trade Agreement that is already in place, which could resolve the problem on the side of the tariffs between the countries. So sometimes it's cheaper right now to import from another continent than to import from a neighborhood country in Africa because of the level of export restrictions and import restrictions. Now, one of the concerns on the Africa Free Trade Agreement outside of the tariffs, because that could be resolved, is the problem of food safety and non-tariff barriers and infrastructure. So infrastructure is a huge problem right now in Africa, and there is required significant investment, and that's where private sector has to come and play a role. But also non-tariff barriers is something that you can do and you can resolve quickly because it's linked to food safety, most of it. And the African Union was trying to push the Pan-African Food Safety Agency, and that's supposed to standardize the food safety standards. So that's I think, a huge opportunity that can come out as a result of this crisis, of the COVID-19 crisis, and I think Africa has to do it because they need to replace the demand that they're going to lose from the north. If not, the producers will have to face that shrink in demand. So that's a very important issue. A global chain is global when it crosses three borders, okay? If it doesn't cross three borders, it's not global. So the only way they will cross three borders is basically if we are able to resolve these problems of food safety, especially in the food commodities. The non-food commodity markets, these are oil and gold and cotton, which is crucial in Mali, for example. Those are going to be affected no matter what because of the recession. The good news is that China is starting to reactivate, which means that there will be a pressure in demand in that side. But still, our expectations, given the world, all the countries of the world are going to negative GDP growth, and according to the IMF, the latest projection is minus 4.8 decline of global GDP, but mostly developed countries will be declining at a bigger rate and emerging economies. So that will affect commodity prices and that will affect non-agricultural prices substantially. That will put in risk countries like Nigeria, which depend on oil exports, and it will put in risk countries of cotton like Mali. For example, there has been a significant reduction in the demand of cotton because the companies doing the value chain of textiles has basically decided to reduce the supply, given that they were not expecting a significant demand during this year. So during this year and the next, that will affect those commodities. Now, what we will be observing is movement also of vegetables closer. So vegetables will be produced more closer to urban and peri-urban cities. Today, vegetables in the world are the commodities that move the less distance. They move very short distances relative to staples and relative to fruits and meats. And it's the only commodity that there is a technology, which is horizontal farming, so controlled environments, that is cost-effective right now. So that we will be seeing in the big cities, close to the big cities, a mobility towards getting closer to cities, and that will require local production, but also, again, food safety standards will be crucial in the case of Africa. So those are, I think, the core elements with respect to trade and interest. So the potential of interregional trade has to be exploited. Global trade, I don't have very good projections for global trade in the next year, so I will focus more on interregional trade.
Thank you very much. I would like to follow up with one question that has just come up on the chat, which would probably also be best directed to you, Maximo. So the question is from Jen Lay, and it is on global food supply chains have overall proven relatively resilient thus far, So food availability in Africa has not been negatively affected, as correctly explained by Maximo. So the question is, has this been good luck? Have we or have policymakers done something right? And will the system be resilient in the next crisis? Is there anything to be learned from this? Sorry, Maximo, you are unfortunately muted. Could you please unmute your mic?
In terms of food availability, we have to split into staples and high-value commodities. No? In the staple world, luckily, we have enough reserves right now. The stocks are at the highest level since the last 5 or 7 years. The stock-to-use ratio is okay. That means that we are still increasing reserves this year. The harvest this year and 2020-2021 harvest is really good. There will be a bumper crop production despite some little shocks in some countries. So the staple commodity world is okay. There shouldn't be any problem, okay? And we don't have a problem right now on availability of food. That's why export restrictions didn't make any sense because food was available. That if that has to do with policymakers or not, I don't think so. That has to do with the private sector, which is playing a big role and is supplying what is supposed to be. Farmers, no? Big farmers and small farmers which are supplying what they are supposed to supply. What has been good is the reserves, but again, there is a risk because a big share of that growth is from China. So China is the bigger buyer of food right now, staple crops. So if China decides to replenish the reserves, they could put some pressure in prices, and that's what we are observing lately for 2 reasons, because they are replacing some of the reserves, and second, there is a pressure because of the pork, because of the swine fever, African swine fever. They lost most of the pork production, therefore they imported, they collected reserves, now they have to replenish that. And that's putting pressure also on soybeans. That's why you are seeing some increasing prices of soybeans and maize and so on. The biofuel industry is basically out of business because of the oil prices. It's trying to resuscitate, but I don't think it will happen soon. That means there is less pressure. So again, good supplies, prices should be okay, stable. High-value commodities, farmers have done a great job and companies, no? They have found a way to cope. In Africa, my understanding is that many companies were working with the government to try to facilitate the mobility of goods, and they really did a great job, the bigger traders trying to negotiate so that the lockdown didn't affect the mobility of food. So that is also resolved, and in that sense, governments have been flexible and smart to dialogue with the private sector to facilitate that process. In the countries that are in conflict, which there are several in Africa, the situation is a little bit tougher, and that is being reflected in significant increases in prices, no? Because of the restrictions, which has exacerbated even more the situation. But we hope that the alarmistic numbers that are being set won't happen in reality, and we hope that this can be reactivated and smoothed out, at least to what it was before COVID-19. The important thing here is that we need to find ways in which we can make these value chains more resilient. And one of the issues outside of transportation and mobility that we found in Africa missing is storage capacity. And this means cooling facilities for storage and also dry facilities. Storage capacity in Africa is pretty far from what it should be. And that's something where, for example, any reactivation and investment should be focusing. Investment in infrastructure that is productive and is linked to productive sectors could pay back in the future, although this year will be very complex because of the recession. But that could make a big difference. We are working with Rabobank and the bank to try to deploy optimal locations of storage facilities, because that will give the farmers the capacity to cope with the time they sell and therefore to wait until they have better prices. And also, if it is done properly, it can be linked to the financial system through warehouse receipt systems using electronic technologies, so ICT technologies, and mobile money, which Africa has, to be able to start including them in the financial market and give them some liquidity to do the next planting, because that's where the farmers are having big problem right now, no? Because they are not selling the same, they have less liquidity, it's more difficult for them to replant for the next season, and that's what we need to avoid. What we need to avoid is that they plant less for the next season, and that's where the emphasis should be put in place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then Holger, I would have a question to you regarding the FDI. So what would you, what is your take on Amy's point of view that actually what will really drive industrialization and economic growth in Africa will be the local private sector investment rather than the foreign direct investment? Would you agree with this statement?
So I think Amy is right in that when she said that FDI has had no impact, and that's probably just a reflection of the very small number of FDI. that we have in the continent, as I said earlier. So nevertheless, if one looks at studies, and there are numerous studies from UNIDO, from researchers from universities and research institutes across the continent and also in Europe and the US, if one looks at the impact of FDI using very specific data on particular firms, you can see that firms that do supply multinationals that are located in sub-Saharan African countries, they perform better, they learn, they increase their innovation, they become more innovative, they go into new markets. So these effects are there. But as Amy said, they are very small because there is a very small amount of FDI coming in. And that was my point, that, and I suppose to answer your question in a very short way, these two have to go hand in hand. So as I said, there is a link between multinationals and domestic suppliers, but these domestic suppliers then also will start to supply other final goods, become exporters, and so on, grow, in other words. So there's this link, and my point was just that I think because of the COVID-induced reorganization of global supply chains, I think there is the potential for Africa to increase its role in global supply chains, to attract more FDI, and then we will see these positive effects. And of course, if this goes hand in hand with also a strengthening domestic sector, this would be the optimal outcome.
Yeah, then a second question to follow up on these opportunities that you mentioned from African countries integrating into supply chains. So what
Sorry, could I jump in on that really quickly just to clarify what I was saying?
Okay, sure, yes.
Yeah, just quickly. So there are two reasons why I don't think FDI is relevant. One, it isn't coming. So and there are lots of reasons why it isn't coming, and as someone who used to look at it from the other side, but you know, the bottom line is it isn't coming. And there's no country in the world that has developed without relying in the initial stages of that development on local investment. So I think if we're serious about industrialization and job creation in Africa, we have to recognize it's going to be done by Africans. And to the extent that investment is going to take place, we need to look at ways in which to mobilize local capacity for financing. And you don't need a lot of local financing to build roads. And you can use local currencies to do that as opposed to using, you know, the expensive US dollar. So the first thing is just from a practical, real perspective of what's going on the ground, you know, if we continue to obsess about FDI and look to that as the solution, it's not, you know, we're going to be stuck. The other aspect of it is we're talking about private sector. Private sector thrives on opportunities created by market failures and challenges. FDI as it is currently constructed and the way bankability is currently defined relies on requires situations where risk is almost eliminated, and therefore the opportunity is almost eliminated. So they want perfect corporate governance, they want 200% security, et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, the requirements for FDI are inimical to the opportunities that the local private sector and even international private sector would be looking to feed into and build their businesses on. And there is, and the final thing I'll say is, there is sufficient capacity in countries like Nigeria for us to mobilize sufficient local private sector to create businesses that, as I said, in 2 or 3 or 5 years are then suitable for FDI to come in. And there will then be loci into which foreigners can easily invest. Ladol is the company I work for is a very good example of that. There are others. But we have to accept, and I think, the development agencies of the world have to accept that if you want to develop African countries, you have to look at in terms of mobilizing African people and supporting that local development, and not necessarily through FDI. You can do it through technology, through other types of partnerships.
Thank you, Amy. Could you maybe explain, because you just mentioned the example of Ladol, could you explain just briefly, how you see the relation between local investment and foreign investment in the context of Ladol, where this is a good example for what you're saying.
So to summarize it, I would say, so Ladol is an industrial free zone. It was built out of literally a swamp. And the business model was a market case. And the market case was there's going to be a huge demand for services, for offshore oil and gas support, and for fabrication and so on, for which there's currently no solution in the market. And this is a golden opportunity because, you know, there's a rationale, you know, to drive the market here was huge, and the cost savings and everything were huge. And our plan was we initially build out the first 20 to 30% of the free zone by building for this market. Once we built for this market, we then leverage the income from servicing these oil and gas companies to build out the rest of the zone and create a circular economy. So phase one, in terms of building the initial infrastructure and facilities, a very large logistics base and fabrication yard and so on, has been completed. It took 20 years, so it took twice as long as we thought it was. Twice as long as we thought it would for lots of reasons. The main one being summarized as significant barriers in the local market to local private sector participation in the market. And a lot of that is also tied to the way in which multinationals operate in countries like Nigeria. And so having completed phase one, which was totally locally funded, we're now moving into phase two, which is developing facilities exactly as Massimo said for industry, for a diverse range of industries, including agriculture. One of the biggest clients we just signed with is an agricultural company that's going to do processing and cold storage in our zone. And in the second phase of our development, we are indeed now attracting foreign investment. But you know, the foreign direct investment that comes into Africa is not designed, the way it's structured is not designed to solve the problems and to support the businesses that Africa needs it to support, where you're basically building on a market case as Ladol has done. So just under $500 million has been attracted into Ladol, but it was all local, despite the fact that the market case was overwhelmingly positive and convincing and everything. You know, the foreign investment just cannot come into businesses like this, let alone smaller ones. But I do see a huge role for foreign partnerships. I do see a huge role for foreign investment, but we have to recognize that it's going to come down the line.
Thank you. Emmy, another question to you that has come up in the chat, because you mentioned that apart from local industrialization, also deregulation is an important aspect to foster, to respond to the crisis and to foster development. And the question was, how do you explain the scenario in Nigeria where electricity tariffs has just been increased and fuel prices rise due to deregulation policy? I believe the question is deregulation policy implemented recently, post-Covid-19, properly situated in terms of the timing? What would be your answer to that?
So my first answer is I'm not a politician, please bear that in mind. But in terms of a local private sector, long-term investor, I think deregulation is good. In order for us to invest in our own market, we need two things. We need access to that market, so we need enabling policies. And as I alluded to, you know, Ladol has struggled with getting access to the market. Now a lot of the enabling policies are there, spotty implementation, but we're getting there. And the second thing we need is for the market failures to be corrected. And what I refer to as market failures is areas where subsidies or other government interventions make it impossible for private sector to participate. So if you're building a power plant, you need to be able to sell that power at a rate that enables you to get a return on investment. And the prices that the government-regulated market were imposing made that almost impossible. And that was one of the reasons why we don't have power in Nigeria. And what happens is the people on the ground suffer more because they end up paying a lot more for their electricity because the national grid isn't big enough and robust enough, et cetera, and so forth. And therefore, they end up going to local solutions. You know, the generator market here is probably the biggest in the world, et cetera, and you end up using a diesel generator that's far more expensive than having a functional national grid or even having mini grids and solutions set up by a private sector. The timing, I completely understand what people are saying. A lot of people are suffering. A lot of people are worried about their jobs. You know, the economy has been hard hit. But the reality is the deregulation is a necessary component, not only to our recovery, but to us coming out of this stronger. So, you know, I think it's important that to get through this period, people lean on each other and government intervenes in other ways to provide more support. As I said, support for SMEs is absolutely essential. And there are other ways government can provide that support while going ahead with the deregulation.
Thank you. Another question I was going to pose to Holger earlier is in terms of, do you see any opportunities in the area of trade and services? There's also, some people are talking about the potential to increase exports of services due to the possibility to work remotely during the pandemic. Do you see, and because we've been mainly speaking about the trade and goods value chain so far.
Yes.
Yeah,
exactly. We've been talking about trade in goods mostly, and also trade in commodities. Yes, trade in services, of course. I mean, that's where generally the potential is going to be for expanding trade worldwide. If there is any potential, that's there. And here, I guess, yes, we have probably fueled by the COVID crisis the new developments, companies realizing that it is a good idea to go into home office to work remotely. And of course, that opens up new opportunities for countries that have skilled workers, as a lot of countries in Africa do, and to be involved in these parts of the global supply chain. So yes, I agree. I think that's one important or a further important potential for African countries to lock into global value chains, and be it in domestic enterprises or be it as part of multinationals, to work remotely and provide these services and be involved in the trade and services.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. And one other topic I would like to address to Maximo. How do you see the potential of digitalization in value chains, and especially in agricultural value chains? There have been like a lot of changes recently. Do you see the COVID pandemic to push this further?
Okay, so yeah, no, it's very important what is happening now to be able to use the digitalization properly for food markets like e-commerce. You need four conditions. You need first the connectivity, of course, the platform, the mobile money, and you need the capacity to move goods from one location to the other, the mail system. In Africa, we have connectivity, not great, but we have enough. In many countries, it's good enough. We have mobile money. We can build the platform. We miss the mail system. That's the problem. So I think those conditions have to come together to be able to get success. And that's where we have to accelerate and fight innovative ideas. So IT technologies are not a panacea. They need to comply with these conditions. And of course, there is a mean to make things work faster. There is a lot of examples of how this can make a big difference. But governments have to play a role here. And because this has to be a public investment, with multilateral organizations, with IFIs, to assure that you have the needed connectivity to assure the mobility of goods. Now, what that means, it means that we need to think a little bit different. If you look at the road corridors of Africa and the plans of expansion of the road corridors, most of them are thinking on the traditional design. which is essentially looking at where the mines were, where the natural resources were, and they're basically upgrading what was there. Now, change that map of Africa and convert it into a map of agro potential, of agricultural potential, and then figure out what linkages you need to do and what penetration roads you need to do to take the benefits of that potential. And that's where the mind has to change. We need to look at Africa as areas of agricultural potential for high-value commodities and for other types of agriculture so that we can exploit that and improve the connectivity of those. What is really sad today, for example, one of the major problems of African agriculture was the lack of access to fertilizers because they were very expensive. So there was a lot of effort to try to build a fertilizer plant in Nigeria. And when I was in the bank, we were able to approve the loan to build up the fertilizer plant in Nigeria, which is now operating. The fertilizer plant of Nigeria can supply fertilizers to almost all Africa. The problem is that when you ask the private sector company, which is managing the big fertilizer plant, is where the products go. Most of the products go to South America. So around 80% of their sales are to South America, not to Africa, which is the continent with the lowest access to fertilizers. And there are several reasons for that. Infrastructure is one, they cannot move, but also trade issues, trade barriers, which complicate the mobility. So for the company, they have to maximize profits. They will go to whatever is the best market for them. But we need to resolve those problems, and that's where governments have to do something. So it's okay to deregulate, that's great, but they need to do something to accelerate that process, because those are the things, those type of public goods are the things that private sector cannot do alone. So I think we need to do that to be able to increase and to benefit from these technologies. So you have 3 of the 4. You need to improve on the last one to be able to make something similar to what happens in China. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. So unfortunately, we're already getting close to the end of this session. There are a few more questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we will not be able to take all of them, but there are some questions in the chat that relate development cooperation. So one question is, how can Europe support small and medium-scale companies in Africa, for example, in Nigeria? Because a lack of financing for a majority of small-scale industries and young businessmen and women has been one of the issues why Africa has not been benefiting as much from global trade as it could. And another question was, is the Marshall Plan addressing the framework conditions for trade and supply chains sufficiently? It is difficult to convince investors when there are weak guarantees, legal protection, etc. So I would like to ask each of the panelists maybe to give like a brief, just 1 minute recommendation for development cooperation. What would be your wishes or your recommendations on how ideally a development cooperation could support the changes in supply chains, basically Africa being able to take advantage from the opportunities that you just mentioned, and or potentially also to mitigate the risks that were mentioned. Just like a 1 minute on your key recommendations for development cooperation. I would maybe start with Maximo again.
So development corporations have huge opportunities if they target properly the interventions. I think, again, as I was mentioning before, we need to start thinking in how to maximize the return of every dollar investment in terms of how many people are moved out of poverty and nourishment. FAO has deployed a program called Hand in Hand, which is basically touching all the least developed landlocked countries, least developed small islands, and food crisis countries. And our plan is territorial approaches. We are basically identifying within the territory where are the opportunities so that we can switch quickly and release the constraints of farmers so that they can produce and sell quickly. And that's where we are more than happy to work with development agencies and development banks to try to help us catalyze the initial investment plans, localized investment plans, different to the CARAP, consistent to the CARAP investment plans, but geographically localized, that are oriented towards problem solving. So we do roundtables of discussion of what are the problems, we prioritize them, and then we develop the investment plan to resolve the problem so that we can immediately move out. Like, for example, in Ethiopia, how we can potentiate the agro parks which already exist, they have some funding, how we can make them really operationalized and make it work. In other continents, how we can accelerate certain value chains where there is agricultural potential. So I think we need to be very proactive in being very targeted to find selective investments that could pay out quickly and which will help to attract private sector and to move the situation to increase efficiency. And the second area where I think is a win-win is food loss and waste. We need to reduce food loss and waste, and especially in Africa, food loss is the issue. And there are very simple solutions like the storage facilities I was referring to, but also improving way in which farmers know more about the standards and markets recognizing the standards through price premiums. If a market doesn't recognize the incentives of an effort of a farmer to improve the quality of the produce, then it doesn't make any sense. So that's where governments can play a role, and that's where the private sector can play a role, and where development banks can play a role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Amy, what would be your suggestions for development cooperation?
Thanks. I think maybe there'd be three things I'd urge them to pursue. One is focus on getting money into the hands of African indigenous entrepreneurs, large and small companies that are developing businesses in the local market, that are adding value and creating additional jobs through the fact that they're growing their local markets. So this is an on-the-ground, African-driven industrialization and trade effort. Secondly, look at local lending. We don't need expensive, foreign currency coming into our businesses. Look at supporting, encouraging, mandating lending in local currencies so that we can develop our economies using our local currency. And thirdly, focus on sustainability. That should be a thread through everything that we're doing. There are all kinds of solutions out there for food safety issues, to food storage issues, to ensuring that the production in Africa stays in Africa where it's needed. But all of these need to be done through a framework of sustainability, and not just because that's the right thing to do, but because that is also the most profitable thing to do for the private sector. Sustainability leads to much higher profitability in the medium to long term, and these are medium to long term projects.
Great, thank you, Amy. And Holger, what would be your recommendations?
Thank you. Maybe I can add my 2 cents to this. So I think for development cooperation, I think what's important is to provide the right framework conditions for local as well as for foreign investments. I think it's important. Aspects of this are firstly openness, and by that I mean openness for domestic and foreign enterprises. It's important to provide what one might call good institutions. So what I said earlier, important support services for local and foreign firms. So by support services, I mean information about suppliers, information about customers. There needs to be some agency that helps with these sort of things in order to get into networks. This is openness in terms of trade. We talked about this, trade within Africa as well as trade to other countries needs to be as frictionless as possible in any circumstances. And that was mentioned by Amy as well. I think access to finance is highly important, in particular for domestic enterprises. And there is an obvious link to foreign investment, but governments or development cooperation can help through other means as well. And Amy talked a lot about this. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. That brings us to the end of our session here. Thank you very much for your participation, Maximo, Holger, and Amy. And also thank you very much to all the participants for the lively questions in the chat. I apologize we haven't been able to address all of them. Maybe also even some of the presenters may be able to add some comments or answers in the chat afterwards. Then we'll come to the next session, which will be on COVID-19 and its impact on the African informal sector. And this session will be moderated by Professor Jan Ley, who is an acting director of the GIGA Institute of African Affairs in Hamburg and a professor at the University of Göttingen. So we're very much looking forward to more interesting inputs in the next session. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks. Corinna, for this introduction. Good afternoon and good morning, in fact, to everybody. I'm very happy to share this third session of this PEGNEt workshop, focusing on the informal economy. I'm Jan Lai, as already said. I'm not acting director any longer. I'm head of the research program, growth and development at the GIGA. That's the German Institute for Global and Area Studies based in Hamburg. And I'm confident that although time is already running, that we will have a very interesting session ahead of us with three speakers from both academia and policy practice, who I will introduce in a second and who you can already see here. We have heard today, again, most of us, that most African governments responded to the pandemic with strict lockdowns, with severe economic consequences. Economic support measures, however, have been far more moderate than elsewhere, for example, in this country. Although the international community has provided considerable additional means to African economies. The economic impacts that we have seen so far are diverse and differ between countries, between informal and formal sectors, industries and traded products. We have seen that trade has partly declined dramatically, and we have seen disruptions in some global value chains. We see a drop in FDI and in sectors that are considered key to Africa's development. In this session, though, we focus on informal workers, who all over the continent have suffered drastic, at least short-term income losses during lockdowns. Very few of them have been shielded by social protection or other policies. And we will shed in this session more light on the short-term and potential long-term impacts on the informal sector, reflect on past and future policies and the role of development cooperation. These are our guiding questions. So which are the direct and indirect impacts on the informal economy? How resilient has the informal sector been to the recent economic shocks? What have been or are the short-term policy responses that we are observing? And how has or will development cooperation adjust? And which policies in the long run can improve the resilience of the informal economy? And what does that mean for development cooperation? You can see here my very competent panel to address these questions. And I briefly want to introduce them. And I start with the two ladies, as so far we have not been exactly gender balanced. So on the right on my screen, there is Renate Hartwig, who is a research fellow at the Kiel Institute of African Affairs and a professor of development economics at the University of Göttingen. She's a development economist with a PhD from the Erasmus University of Rotterdam and works on health and family economics and primarily in and on West Africa. Then there's Karen Wedig, the chief economist for Africa at the GIZ. She holds a PhD from SOAS at the University of London, has also been working in academia as an assistant professor and has consulted on social and economic reforms in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. Last but not least, we have with us Leonard Vancigun, whose detailed bios can be found on hundreds of websites, I learned, including Wikipedia. And Leonard is the founder and president of the African School of Economics, which opened in Benin in 2014. He's a professor of politics and international affairs at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and an affiliate at the economics department. His research interests cover a wide range of topics in development, political economy, and economic history, including democratization, clientelism, real politics, and the long-term social and political impacts of historical events. So that's my panel. And with these brief introductions, I would like to hand over to my esteemed panelists. And we will first listen to the three in a row. While they talk, you can already post questions in the chat. Also questions of understanding. If you think that question can be very briefly answered, then I might just ask the panelists to answer that question of understanding. I will try to keep an eye on this, and then, as before, collect questions and we'll hopefully have some time for discussion. So, floor, Renate, is yours first.
Thank you very much, Jan, for the introduction. And I would briefly like to start by giving you an overview on what the impact on the informal sector has been prior to illustrating some of those points again with primary data that I have collected together with my colleague Tobias Lackerman at the GIGA with micro and small entrepreneurs in Uganda. So as Jan has already said, and what we've heard already across the talk today and the whole, several sessions, impact of COVID on the informal sector has been drastic, and similar to all other sectors, we have seen drastic revenue drops, particularly during the times of lockdown. This also holds for unemployment. So unemployment has also been rising. And while we see that sales figures are already picking up again, particularly in certain areas, so for example, in Nigeria, traders have already recovered their pre-sales figures to about 74% to their pre-COVID levels. Unemployment seems to be responding much slower. So, for example, working hours are still only about 1/4 to what it has been prior to pre-COVID levels. And in Uganda, for example, there are estimates that there will be about 4 million temporary jobs lost due to the COVID pandemic. And observers are generally very much concerned that we will see a consolidation in the labor market. And if we see a recovery, then this recovery is very likely going to be a much more skills-biased recovery, where entrepreneurs are already indicating that they will not re-employ their workforce that they have laid off, but focus towards more generalists or more technical, skilled recent graduates, which will be good news for youth unemployment and for bringing in the youth into the labor market, but which might also be bad news for older employees that then might fall off the grid, and which we don't have any social assistance or support mechanisms for. As a consequence of the income shocks, there have been significant food deprivations, at least in the short run. We've seen a lot of people complaining about not being able to buy foods during lockdown periods. And there have also been severe concerns that the lockdowns have destroyed savings, and estimates suggest that it's about 30% of the population who have lost their savings due to the lockdown initiatives, which has significant implications going forward, because it removes all their resilience and capacity for any future shocks as we come along. Now, as I said, we have collected some primary data in Uganda, which has experienced one of the strictest lockdowns in the East Africa region, and which had a quite strict stay-at-home lockdown for a period of 8 weeks, which is much longer than to a lot of other countries on the continent, which had their lockdowns at around 4 to 6 weeks maximum. And so what we've seen from our primary data is very similar to these global figures that I've just mentioned. So about 80% of the businesses we've interviewed were closed for the 8-week period at least. And even 4 weeks after measures have been eased and businesses were allowed to reopen again, about 40% of our entrepreneurs are still unsure if and when they will reopen. This insecurity falls much stronger on female entrepreneurs than on male entrepreneurs. This has, however, not necessarily to do with increasing care burdens during the lockdowns and school closures and women being likely to stay at home, but is much more driven by the sectoral composition in which these women work. So most of the women work in close contact and service businesses where still measures were in place. So if we think about hairdressing and beauty, it is still unsure to what extent they can operate, giving sort of current hygiene considerations. And the obvious implication from sort of these shutdowns has been that we see a drastic drop in profits and also in household incomes. So household incomes dropped from about an average of $400 in our sample to less than $100, and for profits, they dropped from about $200 on average to almost zero during the lockdown period. We do see post-lockdown some sort of improvements, a slight upward trend. And over the past week, I've just called a couple of our entrepreneurs again to see how the situation has been improving. And most of them are saying that at least their sales and turnover is back to about 50% to pre-COVID levels. So a little bit less positive than the figures that we have seen from the traders in Nigeria, but at least they are somewhat on the road of recovery. Now, how did those businesses cope? In our case, and what we've already seen in the very beginning, the main coping strategy was this saving, and this obviously will have significant implications for the informal sector because it reduces the investment potential going forward, and it also falls on entrepreneurs and businesses which are generally already undercapitalized. The second sort of main coping mechanism has been to rely again on the more traditional support mechanisms, in particularly the family. And while usually we consider sort of these family supports to go from urban sectors to rural areas, this time support actually was particularly flowing from rural areas to the urban center, and this was particularly strong for women that have been affected by the crisis. Now, also within the informal sector, and we've already seen this in the previous session, there has been this hope that digitization might kind of catch up as a consequence. From at least our sample, we don't have any of these big push effects of digitization yet. So some of the businesses have reported that some of their operations have moved towards collecting orders over the phone, but there has not been a huge increase in mobile money transfers or mobile payments to the extent that we do see that in other contexts. So reports, for example, from Kenya and also Rwanda, for example, have been particularly positive on pushing mobile payments as one of sort of channel to go forward. Now, what have been the policy options and the policy responses, at least in the short term? So in Uganda in particular, government has responded to the lockdowns with food distributions, while other countries have also expanded their cash transfer programs, at least in increasing the number of participants. And while these food distributions in Uganda have generally been positive, reviewed or received at least by our respondents, even if they have not benefited from them directly, they have been insufficient in terms of scale, particularly through helping through the lockdown period. There has been this general hope that particularly expanding cash transfers will have a positive double dividend also on the informal sector and work as somewhat of a demand stimulus to kind of help recover demand after the lockdown measures are eased. However, this is unlikely to really kick in, particularly if we consider and look at the sheer scale of current social assistance programs in sub-Saharan Africa, where only about 2% of the population are covered by these schemes. So even if we see a demand stimulus, this is still going to be very much one-off, and it's not going to have this push effect that the economy or the informal sector would need to really pick up from where they have left off back in February. Sort of another alternative strategy has been to increase liquidity into the sector through low interest financing and debt restructuring in particular. However, this has not really benefited the informal sector as much as the small and medium enterprise sector, which is mostly where these programs are located for many governments. And given sort of the informality and the lack of registration in a lot of the informal sector, we don't really have a good coverage here. Then there's ongoing policy discussions that we need more targeted interventions to specific groups that are at risk, particularly female entrepreneurs, older entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. And while we have seen that governments, even if the responses in general might be considered to be very low, they have all implemented economic recovery packages to some extent. Yet if we look at how successful they have been so far, it shows that disbursements across the board seem to be very, very low. So no matter what the short-term policy options are going to be, a key concern is the absorptive capacity of the sector and also of these programs. So to some extent, we'll need to think a bit more structural on how to actually then push this money that is there to the informal sector and also to those in need. I will hold off this very last slide because I think we will come back to the more longer-term perspective on policy options in the discussion, and also I think my fellow panelists will come back on this. So I would like to leave it at this for now. If you would like to have further details on the study in Uganda, then you can look it up on the GIGA website, and there's also an Africa focus coming forward that summarizes a lot of the impacts on Africa. And I'm looking forward to further exchange. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Renate, for I think what was a very good introduction into the topic. And now I would like to hand over to Leonard for his reflections. You are still muted. Can you unmute, Leonard? I can't.
Okay. Yeah. My slides. Okay. All right. So I'm going to take slightly different routes by talking more broadly about economic governance in West Africa during the crisis. Can I can't activate my slide myself. Can you allow me to do it, please, with that group? Okay.
Yeah. Kiel, can you help? I can't. Sorry for that.
Leonard, if you go on your slides on your screen, you'll see a little kind of, I don't know what it's called, oval signpost, which has like a 0, 0, 1, and then an arrow on the bottom. If you click on the arrow, then you can go further to the next slide.
Leonard, otherwise just say next slide, please, and we will do it for you.
Okay, next slide. Okay. Next slide. Okay, sorry. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. All right. So I'm going to talk about the big picture health crisis, and talk about some ideas about government response, talk about policy recommendation next. So I think let me put it this way. We need to stress, we haven't been stressing enough the fact that Africa have done very, very well. Don't forget that, there were 3 million deaths predicted. The infection rates, at least by July, and now today is about 23,000. Next. And, why, and this is spectacular by any account. So why this is? Well, because there are history of handling health risk, limited air links, 70% of the African population less than 30. And also there were a lot of, despite, the economic hardships, there were, popular support for mitigation measures, and then the strong multilateral regional cooperation. So, so Africa can be a model, for the West, in particular for the US, in how to deal with, pandemics. Next. So what should be an optimal institutional design for effective pandemic response? You need to deal with the epidemics. You need a multi-sectoral approach. You need centralization. Next.
And so, and again, if you look at Africa, particularly West Africa in particular, the government response was swift, task force, national, regional level, the presidential prime minister COVID-19 task force to deal with health, with the ministries, technical experts, governance policy, economic policy, next. So, Cote d'Ivoire, for instance, has some of the best in terms of institutional response, appointment of a national response coordinated unit, WHO, involved civil society organization, and so on. So I think the reason why I'm talking about this is because we tend to overlook this very, very, very easily. And I think this is really key, to really appreciate basically what the alternative could have been, if governments in Africa have done things differently. Next. So, there were private sector support in Cote d'Ivoire. This is very relevant for this discussion. 1,500 euro aid to small businesses, self-employed, micro enterprises, social solidarity fund. There were social protection measures in Senegal, in Gabon, and health education investment in Cote d'Ivoire. Next. So, and also there were monetary policy layers. For instance, the regional central bank has offered, 340 billion CFA, provide commercial bank on lending, relaxation of commercial banks to access funds for refinancing, a request for commercial bank to extend the repayment deadline for small, medium enterprises, adjustment made to a timetable for issuing government security. So not only at government level, but also at regional level, there were very swift economic kind of response to the crisis. Next. So now, I think what I would like to do is to just use this opportunity to think about way forward. I think it's important that we understand how to take this opportunity to improve, service delivery, health, education, administrative services, but more importantly, how we can use technology to support private sector through e-commerce, transportation, logistics, and financial services. So, and for instance, there are a lot of open markets in West Africa, and they have been hard hit at the beginning along the line, for instance, of what my colleague just said in Uganda. But I think they coped with the overall situation quite well. So the first 2 months were very hard, 50% drop in income and activities. But then they have been recovered quite well since May or June, at least in Benin and to some degree in Cote d'Ivoire and Senegal from the data that I've seen. So I think we need to just take this opportunity to push harder for the development of e-commerce, transportation, logistics as a way to build IT infrastructure for informal commerce and informal activities in the future. Next. So I think one important issue that also come up is the institutionalization of social security program. So I think it's really important to undertake reform as many informal workers are excluded from current program and moving toward financing model based on general taxation instead of contributing system based on payroll that exclude many informal sector workers. So I think it's important to take this opportunity to institutionalize social security and social protection program, across Africa. Next. So, for instance, Senegal is doing exactly that, and it's supported by the World Bank. Next. And, I think, I need to just take this opportunity to go beyond basically the short-term kind of solution and short-term approach that we are adopting when we are, when we talk about COVID-19. Since Africa has proven to be resilient, have done so spectacularly well compared to US and many European countries, So we need to think about how we can take this opportunity not only to support private sector through IT technology, financing, and so on that I just talked about, but also investment in science and technology. So for a long time, many have pushed for 2-3% government budget in creating labs and promoting advanced scientific research. Is something which is really more should be on the table now, because clearly, in terms of kind of resilience, social, political, to some degree institutional, to pandemics, Africa is quite, it's in good place in general. Now, I think when we need to take this opportunity to sort of provide support for fundamental research, that will benefit not only Africa, but the world in terms of detecting future hotspots for pandemics. And so this is not happening. So increasing support for STEM education in secondary university is something that will be great. But also one of the things that I am going to take the opportunity to mention is the fact that it's the Organization of African Scientists. I mean, like, for instance, there are a lot of labs across Africa, East, West, North, that has done quite well in terms of basically dealing with the science of the current crisis. But they are underfunded. They are not properly organized at the continental level. So it's something that we can actually take this opportunity to correct. Next. So anyway, I mean, I have some slides about how to fix the digital divides and how to improve the the digital capacity of African countries. I can share with you and on the website. Next. Anyway, so I'm going to stop there, but my bigger picture thing, which is that, okay, it may be the only time we have historically to basically tell a more positive, forward-looking story about Africa, and the fact that, if you look, for instance, how some countries responded to the crisis, strict lockdown, contact tracing, support for small and medium businesses, how, informal workers dealt with the shock, I mean, is something that needs to be documented more. And so that's one part of the story. The second part is that we should just switch our attention into how do we use the opportunity to modernize African e-commerce, for instance, science and technology in Africa, so that we can be not only even better prepared for future crises, but we can also use the opportunity to develop other sectors of the economy, given that the infrastructure that we can put in place is something that will benefit the economy more generally. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Leonard, for putting things in perspective and giving the Afro positivists some more food. So, Karin, floor is yours to reflect a bit on development cooperation's role in all this.
No, okay, I had some trouble unmuting myself. Thank you very much, Jan, for the opportunity to be here today with two very distinguished panelists. It was very insightful for me to listen to you. And I allowed myself not to prepare a PowerPoint because I wanted to obviously say something about the role of development cooperation, but also respond to what you've been saying. I actually picked Côte d'Ivoire as an example I wanted to give for how well African governments have responded to the crisis. So I think Leonard has done this for me, and I'll skip that part. But I would like to take a step back, maybe going to what Renate has also been describing from Uganda, and make a few points on the effect on the informal sector or the informal economy, which, despite a reassuring rebound relatively quickly in some parts during the summer months, has been pretty devastating throughout the region. We all know how important informal employment is. It accounts for almost 90%, even more than 90% of employment in western parts of Africa, for example, but certainly around 80–85% of employment throughout the continent. And in the first months of the crisis, the decline in earnings for informal workers was estimated globally at 60%. In Africa, it was estimated at more than 80%. So a few points that are of particular significance for us from the perspective of development cooperation, from the perspective of GIZ. I'd like to point out that the closure of education and training providers has put people in the informal economy at a particular disadvantage, because they are the group, very large group, the majority that is most likely to be unable to benefit from distance and e-learning programs and e-learning training that have been set up quite quickly, despite inadequate infrastructure, IT infrastructure, but there has been a start of a push to digitalization in Africa during the lockdown, during the crisis, since the crisis started. There's also another point I'd like to make, which refers to informal cross-border trade. Informal cross-border trade forms a very large part of the informal economy across Africa. For example, in the SADC region, it accounts for an estimated 30–40% of all intra-SADC trade. Women are the main actors in informal cross-border trade in all countries across the region. In the SADC region, they make up an estimated 70% of the actors. So the suspension of international travel, the strict lockdowns with travel restrictions in the region has had a devastating effect on informal traders and on women in particular. Now, maybe I stick with women and girls. A more general point that we know the majority of the workforce in the informal economy is made up of women and girls. Female-dominated sectors are particularly affected by the lockdowns. Renate also referred to this with regard to Uganda, which means that we are seeing an increase in inequalities, in economic inequalities between men and women. They're likely to increase, but I think we're already seeing with the first numbers that they are increasing. So from a development cooperation perspective, it is vital to further increase the focus on women's economic empowerment. There's also the fact that we see urban-rural migration. The closure of cities during the lockdowns has led to particularly affected traders and actors in the informal economy in urban areas. They have also led to rising prices for basic goods. So we've seen that relatively significant in some countries urban-rural migration. At the same time, the rural informal economy already plays a huge role for employment. So if we look at the informal economy as a source of employment across African economies, we have estimated numbers such as 60% overall, but 80% of employment comes from the informal economy in rural areas. So again, from a development cooperation perspective, it is vital to support the informal economy in rural areas in this crisis, not least because rural areas have provided and are still providing support to urban households or household members and micro and small enterprises that were particularly affected by the lockdowns. So there really is there should be a particular big increase in focus on rural areas. And given that the pandemic in health terms started to expand or infections were rising in urban areas first, and much less so in rural areas. Obviously, also test capacities are less in rural areas, but they're less densely populated as well. So even disregarding the lower test capacities, I think it's safe to say that infection rates are lower in rural areas. So there has been quite a big, at least from a development cooperation standpoint, quite a big focus on urban areas. And I think we have to rethink that and have to make sure that we focus on rural areas when supporting an inclusive and sustainable economic recovery. A last general point I'd like to make on the effects on the informal economy in Africa that we've been observing are the fact that migrants are a particularly hard group. Renate, in her fascinating account of fresh data from Uganda, made the point of affected households and economic actors relying more than usual, more than before, on family networks. And this is something that migrant workers typically do not have access to. Let's take Ghana as an example. There are nearly 500,000 international migrants, mainly from the ECOWAS countries in Ghana. They're mostly informally active. The vast majority works in the informal economy, especially in agriculture and trade sectors. And in contrast to the local population, they tend to have very limited social networks to bridge the economic impact of the lockdown. And here again, we have that gender inequality, especially migrant women often live in precarious conditions without access to safe drinking water or adequate sanitation. So within that group, we also see women as being the most extremely affected and threatened by extreme poverty. So this means our support, again, from a development cooperation perspective to the economic recovery, I argue has to go beyond narrowly defined instruments and to supporting economic development. So we have to look at multi-sectoral approaches. I think Leonard also referred to that. And we have to refocus on equality. A last point on the focus of German development cooperation in particular in Africa. You all know how strong our focus has been since 2017 on foreign direct investment promotion and employment-intensive foreign direct investment promotion, I should say. And there naturally was a focus on formal sector employment that came along with that approach. We obviously have continued to work on supporting African companies and supporting African companies' integration in international value chains. But there also, as with all FDI promotion approaches, there has been a tendency to not target the smallest enterprises that do not have an immediate growth potential to integrate in international value chains. And I do think that we have to think about this again, and we have to think harder about how we can increase or expand our focus to also look more closely at those micro and small enterprises that do not have that immediate growth potential to integrate in international value chains. So I skipped my part on phrasing the Côte d'Ivoire response, maybe just quickly, I would like to emphasize also that many African governments have responded to the pandemic fast. But we've also seen that the budgets available to them are too limited to reach large numbers of people, especially in the informal economy. And there are very few tried and effective functional social security structures in place which can be upscaled. So I'd like to emphasize the point that Leonard made about institutionalizing social security structures. We need institutional structures, support to institutional structures that can allow existing programs to be upscaled and new programs to be set up and to be institutionalized. And I think we also need in our development cooperation work in African countries and with African partners a stronger focus on economic inequality than it has been so far. And maybe last but not least, African solutions, homegrown solutions. I strongly agree with Leonard, what you said about this crisis also being an opportunity, a potential opportunity to push for African and Pan-African solutions. And I think as a development cooperation partner, we would like to support those African and Pan-African solutions.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Karin. And thanks to all of you for, I think, excellent contributions in understanding the bigger picture in which these impacts on informal activities are being placed. And I will pick up, I only have one question so far on the chat, so please think further, but I will pick up on that in a second. I think there are a whole lot of questions to be asked to all of you. I would like to remain for a second with the responses by African governments that we have seen and also the international support. Since in a sense, we've been seeing those strict lockdown policies, and we've heard from Leonard and partly also from Renate that there have been government reactions that, well, I would consider rather moderate, right, as I said in my introduction. And I think I would like to understand a bit better what you think about what has been happening in the past few months. So are we seeing the program that you mentioned, Leonard, for example, in Côte d'Ivoire? We are also working with small and medium enterprises and the corresponding agency there in Côte d'Ivoire. Do you think that they can hold up to the promises? Were they quick enough in releasing the funds that they were provided with? And what do we have in other experience? The transfer program in Senegal that you alluded to, is that working? I know that a similar one has been put into place in Togo. Are governments able to deliver in time? And what are the experiences in development cooperation? Maybe Leonard, you can say.
Yeah. In fact, honestly, I'm a little bit behind in terms of collecting more updated information about how the program is working. But what I know is that the health crisis has been dealt with quite well, and is still the case. For instance, the opening of international airports, controlling the transmission of the virus, and also the extremely hard work that many scientists are doing. Personally, I'm working with a colleague from Institut Pasteur in Côte d'Ivoire. It's crazy. They go to work at 5 a.m., come back at 11 p.m. every day. They are on it. And I think we are not hearing enough about these things. We are not talking about how the health community, African governments are putting health first and working. They understand better than anyone that unless you have a hold of the disease, you cannot have a very sensible economic program and economic recovery, and I think, okay, so now in terms of the logistics, in terms of how the government program are working, yes, I need to collect some better information to see how this is, how it's going. But I think based on what I said, the focus should be, I don't know how well they deliver, but it's less of a problem. It's for us the opportunity to say, okay, now let's invest massively in IT technology so that open markets can be more digitalized, financial kind of services can be more digitalized. We can take that opportunity to improve e-health and e-education as well. So I think it should be less about how they have done recently and whether there are issues. I think it should be, let's take this opportunity to have a big push on technological innovation and technological development, because that would be the best support we can currently provide for the informal sector. Because if we have that, then it will be easy to target small firms and give them support. Social protection program will be easier to deliver, and also they can improve their activities in terms of productivity even more. So I think project for development cooperation should be, how do we get these guys? How do we help these guys, for instance, to digitalize their economy now that we know they have the social political infrastructure in place to at least cope a little bit with this kind of situation. Anyway, yeah. I'm still very general because I'm not up to date in terms of the data, but that's the point I wanted to make.
Yes, well, I think that's very well taken. And I think we also have agreement that these, they call them structural challenges that concern, in particular, small and micro firms need to be tackled. Yes, I would like to remain with the informal sector and its resilience for a second, and also picking up on a question that was being posed in the thread, since it touches upon our core issue here, that is the informal sector and how it can be protected against economic shocks, and for sure that won't be the last one, right? So there will be recessions, there will be problems of domestic kinds, the domestic recessions that affect economies, and I think we all agree that many of these informal enterprises are not well protected, right? They fall in between. Even if there is a social protection scheme, they tend to fall. They are often not protected. So that's not a sub-Saharan African issue alone, right? They have a similar issue in countries where those systems are in place. And then let us now reflect a bit more on what this means and looking forward. So how can we solve this problem, right, of protecting those that are not necessarily the poorest, the most vulnerable, right? So that's a bit the problem. And maybe Renate, you can come in, chipped in then by Karin on the role of development cooperation on this question. So relates also to how specifically should we design those systems that in the future can protect them better? Is that only about expanding social protection, or do we find better ways of targeting?
Yeah. Sorry, Karin, if I might jump in first. I want to reflect on two things that Leonard has said, because I do see them very similar. I also think that the health crisis has reasonably well dealt with in African economies compared to, for example, other countries where we see that they have prioritized economy before health, that are now really struggling with getting the pandemic under control and seeing extreme serious repercussions, not only on politics, but also on their economy. And a case in point, for example, would be Indonesia, that is really suffering at the moment. But I also want to come back to what Leonard has said with respect to use this now as an opportunity for more structural changes. And I think more structural changes will be needed, particularly if we want to tackle the informal sector and kind of provide broader safety nets. And this will in my opinion, sort of one way forward would be to really push towards more formalization, and formalization not necessarily in getting the entrepreneurs registered, but on getting people registered. And I think a lot of countries now have been moving towards improving targeting databases and moving towards establishing social registries. Rwanda, for example, has just finished this massive exercise, and it has taken them more than 5 years in total since sort of they had the very first discussions with the World Bank on these types of things. But what this will do, it will allow that when future pandemics and crises are coming up, that we at least will be able to have a record of people. And even if they are not registered with respect to their activity or their business, we will be able to have a registry in respect to their wealth class or group, which will then help targeting. Because a big problem of the expanding the current cash transfers is that a lot of the targeting databases that we do have in place at the moment in those countries are outdated. A lot of the self-targeting that countries have been trying to do using mobile technology and sort of people calling in have not been working so well and have created also a lot of pressure on the existing system, and their support and payouts have been much slower than expected, even if sort of a lot of people, for example, in Kenya, signaled that they would need support and that they are eligible for sort of an expansion of the cash transfer programs. So I think moving towards more formalization and maybe pushing for these more structural social registry type systems would also then allow to implement more automatic stabilizers similar to those that we do see here in the West. So thinking of wage subsidies, even if they are not perfect in the West, and we know that exclusion errors are high, that does give governments some short-term measures that could be very effective to tackle future crises. And so for development cooperation to pick up on these more structural issues, which so far, at least sort of from an outsider perspective, seem to be very context and country specific and have not really been pushed for on a broader scale, would be something that I would consider at least an opportunity to do now, because people are also willing to register in those potentially more likely than they did at any other points in time for privacy concerns or others.
Yeah. So thanks a lot, Renate. I see a lot of nodding on Leonard's side, and I think I also agree with much of what you said. Let me, Karin, a 1 minute statement and then a final one by Leonard to close this session before I hand over to someone else for a wrap up. Please try to be brief, Karin. Yeah, but you need to let her speak. Oh, yes.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So I certainly agree with that focus on formalization and maybe I'd more call it a fluidity in economic terms between informal and formal economic sectors, because from a practical implementing viewpoint, it really needs to be considered that it's hard for us to reach informal economy actors directly, and we often go via formally registered companies, for example, when talking about private sector promotion, who work closely with informal micro enterprises. So that really is important for us to not look at the informal economy, but look at the fluidity between the two and try to enable and empower informal economic actors to gradually formalize, to gain access also to social protection, but also other forms of structural support. And then I'd like to say one more negative point that I'd like to remind ourselves of, that in many African countries, the economic crisis caused by the necessary lockdowns is intersecting with other crises due to climate change, due to environmental degradation, or due to security crises. So that really needs to be seen, because that also means that in some areas, in some countries, we're seeing increases in authoritarian regime structures, which will make it more difficult to move towards an empowerment of disempowered people economically, socially, politically. So we need to bear that in mind.
Yeah, and thanks. And over to Leonard on a positive note, for sure.
Okay. So I know I think I agree with my colleagues entirely, not only on the formalization and the opportunity for structural change, but also the point that was just raised about by Kellen about authoritarian kind of backsliding that's possible as a result of this. And but I think one important point that I thought is very, very important to stress as well is to see, to also seek this opportunity for inter-regional trade, for resiliency, because of the closure of international borders, for instance, Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Cote d'Ivoire, you may have seen a new trade networks developing as a result. And it should be, an opportunity to expand the market opportunity for small, medium enterprises, and as a result. So I think, besides all the things we have talked about, I think one aspect would be inter-regional and domestic trade opportunities, access to local markets by SMEs. That could be another channel through which, for instance, this could be an opportunity for positive structural change in African economies.
Yeah, thanks a lot. As I said, positive note, and we've heard that before, reshoring, intra-regional trade, so these are opportunities that may be arising from this crisis. But before I wrap up, I hand over to my colleagues to wrap up. And that means I hand over to Rainer Thiele, the head of the Poverty Reduction, Growth and Poverty Reduction Equity and Development Group at the Kiel Institute, who will now chair the wrap-up session, for which will be another 15 minutes or so. Thanks a lot to my esteemed speakers for your questions and for what I think has been a very interesting and productive discussion and day and workshops so far. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jan.
Okay, welcome to this last session of our workshop today. And since we have only 15 minutes for this session, it will not really be a full-blown wrap-up what we are going to do, but we will rather focus on one specific aspect. So as I'm a member of PEGNEt, I'm very much eager we are very much eager to foster the exchange between research and practice. And we have now heard many presentations which were mainly based on research, some were mainly based on practice, and I will try, at least in this final session, to bring these two things together. And the idea is to get to know the extent to which research on COVID-19 has been helpful for development cooperation. And I'm very happy to welcome two speakers who are very well suited to deal with this question. On the one hand, we have Birgit Seibel, who is head of the section Economic Policy and Private Sector Development at GIZ. And we have Dr. Thomas Dube, who is Director of Department Southern Africa and Regional Funds at KfW Development Bank. And I will pose two questions to both of the panelists, so to say, here. And I start with the first one, which is that I would like to know to what extent has the implementation of the activities in your specific institution that respond to COVID-19 so far been influenced by research. And I would like to start with Birgit.
Thank you. Happy to answer to that question. And I would say that research has been really very important for GIZ in two ways. So on one hand, to analyze the effects overall of the crisis and use this really for the adaptation and adjustment of our projects and approaches. And I would say, secondly, by being able to use a global research network as the PEGNEt, to exchange and work with local research institutions for further analytical work. And I think both have been really crucial. So to analyze the effects and then use it for the adaptation of our projects, we started with really looking at the effects on economies, jobs, and markets, and the whole analytical work was based on research produced by Kiel Institute, GIGA, African Institute for Development Studies, African Development Bank, but of course also OECD and others, so ILO. And we developed a set of short, medium, and long-term approaches, how to really respond. And luckily, we were able, within the result frameworks of our projects, Mr. Oswald mentioned that today, that we are quite flexible. And I would say so far, we mainly supported the setup of short-term measures, really looking, for example, at private sector development, MSME support, to set up subsidies and assistance schemes for MSMEs and look at the provision of liquidity to avoid bankruptcy and so on, and also support our partners, because if we were luckily able to continue with our work because we still have our colleagues in the countries and can continue to work with the partner ministries, business development service providers, central banks, and so on and so forth, to support them also to analyze the effects on their specific industries. And if you ask to what extent our project implementation has been influenced, the adjustment by research, I would really mention a couple of aspects. And I think they were mentioned before by Ami, by Holger, Leonard, and Karin. So I think there is a much stronger focus on supporting local production, of course, and local investments, and regarding FDI, for example, keeping investors and guarding them rather than attracting new ones. And I think the other aspect really to combine or to look at social security measures and combine that with economic policy measures, I think, and really taking into account the different groups and specifically also vulnerable groups. And lastly, also to look at the opportunities. And I think that was mentioned many times today in the panels, digitalization, technology, e-commerce, and so on. And we also commissioned a couple of studies where we also were happy to be able to connect in a very quick way via PEGNEt and other research networks with local research institutions, and were really able to have the research done on local level. I think you're still muted. If I'm...
So you're unmuted now.
Okay, thanks. Yes, a lot has been said during the day, and I would like to focus in my short presentation on let's say two different types of research which informed what we have been doing at KfW regarding to the COVID crisis. One, I would say, is research which is focused on the content of the projects we were implementing, and the second part is research which informed us on how to do projects in such an uncertain and volatile environment. As I listened to presentations we had during the day, quite a number of people said that we had very different expectations on how the epidemic would turn out on the African continent than the situation we are looking today. So zooming back to the beginning of the epidemic, when we were informed by our ministry that quite a lot of money will be available to implement a significant number of projects. So I would estimate that we started already at KfW all over the world around 100 projects, additional projects. We were just thinking, what are we going to do with the capacities we are having? And basically, I would say we were looking at extremely short-term projects, short-term and medium-term projects. We are not yet in the position to say we are really looking at long-term influences. And when I'm now going back to the extremely short-term projects, the first question is, where can we do something which is really on the ground immediately? We're talking here, usually we're talking financial cooperation of timeframes of a year or 2 years until we get a project working. Here we were looking at a situation where we said this has to be done within weeks. And so we decided we only see 2 sectors where we will be able to act very quickly. I'm now talking about the Southern African region, where I'm most familiar with. That was the health sector and social cash transfers. In the health sector, we were looking clearly, our technical experts were discussing with the science community what are things which are useful, which we can bring in via procurement and assisting in financing medical equipment with procurement. This worked out actually very nicely. Our ministry gave us additional funds in a few countries, and we were able to get these procurement projects started within weeks. And now looking back at it, we saw it was also pretty successful. Social cash transfer programs. These are programs which have been designed by science. If I look at the case of Malawi, for example, and which have also have had accompanying research over the years on and on, so we know exactly what we are doing. And there we said, okay, we can just double or increase the amount of payouts to help the poor people in the situation. And that was also something which could be done immediately. And now I will only talk about what I would call short-term measures. Then we said, okay, now we can sit back a little and think, what are we doing to cope, to help the economies and the states to cope with economic disruptions? And the first thing we came up with was, don't disrupt what we are doing. And that was actually also something which was informed by science. If you're looking at post evaluations, ex post evaluations of especially investment projects, you always see, very often you see that disruptions in the project execution have had a very negative influence. And so we said we keep everything going as long as it goes well. And surprisingly, and very positively surprisingly, our big infrastructure projects which were going on, for example, in the health sector or in Mozambique, we had a lot of projects still going on, coping with the effects, with the aftermath of the Idai storm crisis last year. That went very well, and it continued. And the second thing was also that we said when we are now designing new activities, we should be able to act quickly. And there we were looking at aspects which we also have seen in Germany, and it was supporting industries which are crucial. And there we focused on the tourism industry related to biodiversity. And then also looking at research which has been done, how this could be best implemented. We managed to get these projects also working pretty well. So as I said, this double dimension, how to implement projects, and then just building on what we have already had in scientific research to inform us what is the focus of what we had until now. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a second related question, and please a short answer to that. So what are your expectations about the role that research can play? And maybe also, is something lacking in your view in the research landscape? It's of course been only a very short period since the outbreak of COVID-19, but there is a lot of research around. But do you think it goes in the right direction, or do you think there should be other foci in the research so as to assist you even more efficiently? Maybe Mr. Duwe is going to start.
Yeah, thanks. Glad you take that up. So if we're now looking at, I would say, more longer term projects and activities we would try to design in the aftermath of the COVID crisis, we somehow feel that we will see a lot of, I would say, old or well-known problems just in a worse form. Just today I was informed by our office in South Africa that the employment rate has risen from 30 to 42% in the aftermath, or it's not the aftermath, in this ongoing crisis. So what I would hope is that what is already there in research, and what is already centered on aspects like youth unemployment and how to cope with it, stimulate private sector investment into that will be just become more and more intense than it has been before, to just help us to cope with this increasing crisis. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And Birgit, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I think research will be absolutely crucial also in the next time. I mean, on one hand, still to continue to further analyze the effects on very specific markets and vulnerable groups, but I think also to really look at the effectiveness of the policies that have been taken and what works and what doesn't work, and maybe also to look at the differences. One of the comments hinted at the fact that SADC has weathered the crisis better than others. So to maybe also really look at the differences of the policies that have been taken and find out why. And I think a really clear focus should also be to look at the opportunities, how we can capture the opportunities that have come through the crisis to really drive economies. I think digitalization, e-commerce, that's key, and how we really as development cooperation and policymakers can drive that forward. I think also Build Back Better and green recovery will be a very important issue, and I would really find it very, very helpful if research comes up with very pragmatic recommendations for policymakers. I think that was mentioned today as well. The research as such is very important, but really with a clear focus on pragmatic policy recommendations. And I think also, lastly, I find these exchanges as today, where research, academia meets development cooperation and policymakers, I find that very helpful to have this from time to time to really check and see where are the research questions going. And as you ask, where are gaps and where are still questions open, to really inform each other, development cooperation, to really get pragmatic recommendations, and at the same time for researchers also, what are the questions we still have and where we really need support through research. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think this was a nice last word, and it was also in line with our mission in PEGNEt to have this exchange between research and practice. And I don't want to summarize again and I would even not dare to do it, to summarize what we had today. But I think it was a stimulating workshop, and I can only thank everybody for staying with us. And it was a long workshop, 3 hours. Online workshop is quite a bit. Yeah, thank you very much to the speakers, to the moderators, and also to the participants. So I think we had a lively discussion today, and hopefully everybody learned a bit. I did so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.